debaters, but who could be won over by a campaign which they felt was a well-run, positive, admirable campaign, if you like. I think that was the right thing to do. There was a journalist, it may have been David Torrance, I'm not absolutely sure. Someone said earlier this year, and I think it was about right, they said, well, there's no such thing as a completely positive or a completely negative campaign. The reality is, yes, Scotland is probably 80% positive and 20% negative, whereas Better Together are 80% negative and 20% positive. And that's probably, whether one takes those percentages at face value or not, I think that's probably a right, that they would occasionally try to talk in a positive way about, the shared history and culture of the UK and present, I feel like, an emotionally positive case for the Union. But the default position for them was attack, negative, negative, negative. We were largely trying to get people excited and intrigued by what we could do as an independent country in terms of fairness and prosperity and social justice and a stronger democracy. And I think genuinely engaging people around those themes. But we also, I think, very strongly attacked the record of Westminster, the way in which the Westminster system, the Westminster elite have let Scotland down. And that was a very significant part of the campaign as well.
So I think that was actually a very successful part of the campaign as well, because whatever happened after the referendum, the trust in Westminster is gone. Even if people didn't have trust before, I think there was maybe a bit of an indifference towards it. But now people have been woken up to what goes on down there, and there's certainly no trust or particularly warm feeling towards it.
I think that's right, Michael. But I find a very interesting distinction, because obviously, having been around for a while in media, I mean, I knew a lot of people who were on the other side of the argument in this referendum. And I think a striking thing to me is every Yes person who was in touch with me during the campaign or has been in touch with me since, and I've had loads and loads of people, literally hundreds of people in touch since the referendum, are all very, very positive about the campaign. They're proud to have been part of it. People found it an uplifting experience. They loved being part of that community. They loved being part of something bigger and trying to find a new sense of direction and purpose for Scotland. And people really, really enjoyed it. And that, I think, is a stark contrast to, when you talk to people who were on the other side, some of them are pretty shamefaced about the campaign. I mean, some of them were pretty negative about the Better Together campaign during the referendum, let alone since. But, I think one of the reasons why you get people like Alistair Darling now saying, oh gosh, the winners have behaved like the losers and losers have behaved like the winners. And there's this vacuum after the referendum where the winning side, if you like, went awfully quiet. I think that was because an awful lot of them, frankly, were not awfully proud of the campaign they'd run. I certainly took part in debates during the referendum where people who were speaking on the other side in the debate would dissociate themselves from the campaign quite strongly. I remember debating with a Labour guy up in Inverness, and he kicked off by saying, I'm here speaking for the Labour Party. I don't speak for Better Together. That's nothing to do with me. So I think there is that contrast that, rightly or wrongly, and perhaps more for someone of a more independent view on this to judge, whether the way they ran the campaign was the right way to run the campaign or not in terms of getting the result they wanted, which is an interesting question. It certainly didn't enthuse and inspire an awful lot of people who were on the no side of the argument. And I think has given them a real problem after the referendum, that a lot of the energy and enthusiasm that's carried on with the Yes folk just isn't there on the other side,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's a fine line between what you would call a campaign tactic or strategy and what you would call a dirty trick. It kind of depends how you're looking at it. But, I mean, how do you feel about some of the allegations of dirty tricks? I can certainly tell you about things I've been told firsthand about what people were told by campaigners, what people were told on the doorstep by people from Better Together, and what people were told on the phone. I can certainly tell you that, in the days running up to the vote, people were being phoned by campaigners from a number in Cambridge, for example, telling them to vote no and things like this. But that can be a campaign tactic, that can be a dirty trick. But the simple fact is, if you saw on the streets in the sort of month running up, or in the 6 weeks running up, there weren't many Better Together campaigners out. And then in that last week, there were suddenly hundreds just appeared from nowhere. And it was quite strange. I mean, how did you feel about some of the different allegations of dirty tricks, and did you expect them?
Well, I think, if you the dirtiest of the dirty tricks, if you like, or the thing which angered people more than anything else was the pretty obvious attempt by the UK government to get businesses to come out and attack the idea of independence and to raise fears about what might happen in the event of a yes vote. And while that was something we expected, nevertheless, when it happened and the way in which it happened, I think did anger a lot of people. The Better Together campaign was always, it seemed to me, I mean, and again, I don't have inside track information on this, but I think it was always premised on the belief, the knowledge that they were going to get the support of most of the commercial press, and they were very much based on the three political parties that constituted Better Together. So I don't think they started out with any notion that they were going to build a kind of genuinely grassroots movement. I think they always saw it as a top-down campaign, three political parties with pretty much a fair wind through most of the commercial media, and therefore that would be enough. That would do it, with the UK government chucking in, and organisations they could influence, chucking in lots of grenades, if you like, to try to blow up the Yes campaign. So the two campaigns had a very, very different approach. And I agree with you. I mean, there was no evidence all the way through the campaign of anything substantial on the ground from Better Together. I've no idea about a lot of different places. I went out knocking doors in lots of different communities around Scotland, because if I was going to speak at a meeting or if I was visiting a particular part of Scotland, I'd always ask to go out knocking doors with the local Yes people, so I could get a sense of where things were in that area and what the local mood was. And I always ask people, all around Scotland, wherever street you're on, you'd say, well, have the other campaign been down your street? Have they knocked your door? And I never ever was on a street where Better Together had been. Whether that was in Glasgow or Edinburgh or the Islands or in the North East. I've never knocked a door where the other campaign had knocked it before us or had been visible there. So there was not that level of grassroots activity, which was fantastic, and so many people around the country did so many fantastic things for us. They obviously took the view that very negative campaign was the way to go, and Project Fear was the way to go. And again, I presume that some of them will feel that approach was vindicated by the result on the day. However, and I think it was Ian McWhirter who made the point, first of all, certainly in the press some months back. He made the point then that his perspective then was, okay, it looks likely that no is going to win here, because certainly the polls at that time were suggesting it more strongly than they were closer to the referendum. But he said, the longer term damage they may be doing the union here because of the nature of the campaign is something that they haven't properly considered. Because even if this approach means that people stand back or can't quite bring themselves to vote yes this time, essentially the fabric of the union is being so badly damaged by the nature of this campaign that there will be a longer term consequence. I think that is true, and I think we are already seeing the signs of that. Whether or not the strategy of the No campaign was right in terms of getting the result on the day, which was the whole Project Fear approach and that kind of intimidation of people and painting the worst possible scenario, whether it was the right thing to do, because some of it went beyond just being warnings. Some of the things that were being said were outright threats to the living standards, the security of people in Scotland. It has undoubtedly gone down badly with a lot of people, even some of the people who voted no. And I think that is something that will play into the way that Scottish politics develops and the way the constitutional debate develops.
Yeah, and I was going to leave that for the last question, but there was just one more thing I'd like to bring up before we get there, is that you had an interview shortly after the debate saying that you didn't feel that the BBC had been biased during the debate. In this conversation, we've talked about certainly the press were extremely one-sided in the whole affair. But I think you're possibly slightly at odds with what most people feel about the issue of the BBC. Could you explain why you think the BBC weren't biased?
I think what I said was somewhat oversimplified and probably misunderstood for that reason, Michael. I don't dispute there were individual items and individual programmes and sometimes individual presenters who did not show the proper degree of impartiality in the referendum. The notion I was questioning, which was the one that was being put to me most frequently, was that there'd been a sort of top-down strategy within the BBC, almost command from within the BBC, that employees, journalists, programmes should work to undermine or damage the Yes campaign. That's just what I find. I can't support that, or I don't have evidence for that. And the number of people would have to be part of that, knowing the BBC as I do, journalists are natural whistleblowers. It's just, if there was that kind of organisational corporate strategy to do that, which I would find unlikely, then it would just come out in lots of different ways. It would be something that would have been revealed. So what I've never said and wouldn't say is that I've never given the BBC a clean bill of health in terms of how they handled the referendum campaign. I think they got a lot of things wrong. I do believe there would be a great benefit to the BBC and to everyone else from an independent academic study of the BBC's coverage of the referendum. I think there were a number of ways in which they got their approach wrong. And I think it was a huge editorial challenge for them, because Britishness and being part of the fabric of the UK is such an important part of the BBC's sense of itself and of its identity. And I don't think they probably got across enough to the reporting and presenting teams, particularly I would say the London-based reporting and presenting teams, the need to be absolutely rigorous and absolutely neutral in tone and content. And that's why there were some items, I think, that did cause us concern. But I'm not, as far as I'm aware, I don't think, if I look around the Yes campaign, or certainly the political parties within the Yes campaign, I don't think either the SNP or the Greens, for instance, have initiated a formal complaint of, breach of the BBC's charter or breach of the BBC's obligations and impartiality. So I suspect people probably have the same view as I do, which is that there were lots of things we would have regretted and lots of things we got them to change in the course of the referendum campaign. But I would just myself stop somewhere short of the feeling that I know a lot of people have, and the anger that I know a lot of people have, which they have translated into a belief that there was a kind of an organisational mission within the BBC to do down the Yes campaign.
If I can just move that then from the specific to the general, because I come from a sort of background in part of my background's in media studies and media analysis and research, and there's an idea that comes out in Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky, but it's quoted just as well by George Orwell, which was circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip, but the really well-trained dog is the one that turns his somersault when there is no whip. And this can feed into this media analysis idea where, is it the case that without giving diktats from central command, if you like, of the BBC or other media organisations, you hire the journalists that aren't going to go into the areas that you don't want them to? I mean, is there a case of that and then a kind of institutional bias grows without anyone actually saying it? I mean, is this kind of... You've been inside media organisations. Is this kind of thing a possibility?
Well, I know what you're saying, and there may be a bit of that. My own personal experience of this was, and again, a lot of other people who had a prominent role in the campaign, who were in broadcasting studios a lot of the time, and it'd be interesting to get some of their views as well. But I think that there was just, I think particularly some of the network presenters, I think there was almost a view. Network presenters, maybe some correspondents, there was almost a view that they themselves found the desire for Scottish independence somewhat puzzling and mysterious. They couldn't quite get their heads around it, and they thought that at some level this was an eccentric thing for people in Scotland to wish to do, and I thought that came across in some of the tone and the content. But I took part in a lot of programmes, and I often came across people who were doing their jobs perfectly properly and professionally, and had lots of interviews about which I'd have no complaint at all, dealt with lots of reporters who I thought covered the campaign well. So, I think you have to be specific about items and reporters with whom we felt we had a serious problem, and then you have to look at those items and analyse those items. Because in the general course of the referendum, there were a lot of folk who were trying to do their jobs properly. Equally, as I said, there are other people who clearly were giving away, if you like, their attitude. We wouldn't necessarily be hostile, but just as I say, they weren't fully up to speed with the debate and didn't quite understand it. I remember being asked towards the end of the referendum campaign in one interview, I think it might have been on the Daily Politics, if Scotland voted yes, was there anything I would miss about England? And it was such an odd question. I'd almost paused.
It's quite bizarre.
Before answering it, and I said, well, no, because I'm going to, like everybody else in Scotland, like most people in Scotland, I've got friends and family in England. I'll carry on visiting them, so I'll see quite a lot of England. So no, I'm not going to miss England. It was almost like this interviewer had in their head the notion, the cartoon notion that Scotland was going to physically detach itself and head off to a different part of the planet or something.
This is just a bizarre notion. It's like asking if they ban chocolate, will you miss crisps? It's an extraordinary question.
Well, it is. I know, and I think this is. So I think this lack of understanding was a big thing, and I think as this came across in some of the network correspondence, there's no doubt that some of them came up to, when they occasionally did come up to Scotland at high points in the campaign, if you like, they did come up with a view that, well, the BBC people in Scotland had obviously not sufficiently rumbled or sorted out the independence campaign, and they would bring their greater expertise and know-how and would expose us for the sort of the shambles of a campaign or whatever that we were. So there was a bit of that. There's a bit of metropolitan elitism, that